Hi everyone. Alright, first things first. A bit of a confession this week. I was going to do a totally different video than the one that I'm now actually making. I wanted to do kind of an unusual World War II unit for you this week, and I had some finished ski troops that I'd gotten from Warlord that I'd had laying around for quite a long time, and I actually got 3 packs of them, I think, over a course of a year or so from Warlord. They just gave them or sent them to me at different times, and you know, I kind of was saving them for, at first, to kind of do in the winter because it seemed like an appropriate thing, or to show you how to paint white. But of course, I've already done some other videos showing you how to paint white recently, but you know, I was thinking maybe now is a good time for them. So I started getting them ready, prepping them to paint, trying to put them together, and they're kind of a pain in the butt to put together, honestly. They're in a lot of parts, and they tend to fall apart easily because the glue joints aren't really all that good. They're one of Warlord's earlier ranges too, so they're not very big. They're, especially compared to modern ranges, they're absolutely tiny, so I think they probably wouldn't even fit with some of the newer figures. And I was sitting there kind of painting, trying to paint the face on this guy, and I was thinking, this looks really bad, because I'll be honest, the sculpting on these guys is really not great. And it's actually a frustrating experience to try to paint them because the faces are kind of a mess, really kind of rough. So it just came to a head, I guess, for me. They were not staying together very well. The sculpting was bad. They were tiny figures, which I really don't like very well. So kind of all that added up, I was like, you know what? I'm not going to do these. So sorry to Warlord for that, but your finished ski troops really aren't very good. Maybe that's why you gave me so many boxes of them. You don't want to have them, you want to get rid of them or something. But yeah, they're not good. I wouldn't recommend them at all, honestly, as far as figures go. But that's nothing against Warlord in general. You have some really, really awesome figures besides that, and in fact, I am going to be painting another Warlord figure for you today, but it's one of the really new ranges, and I wanted to keep with the theme of doing kind of a weird World War II figure, something that's not, you know, quite normal. So I ended up with this guy, because we had them kicking around too. This is a German sailor who has been recruited for some, you know, hand-to-hand combat, which you have to admit is pretty strange. And these figures are great. They're big, beefy figures like you like, but they're really characterful too. There, maybe you can see he's got a really creased, weathered face. You know, it kind of actually like reminds me of Popeye, in fact. And a lot of the figures, all the heads in this are really very much like this. They're quite silly, but they're a lot of fun to paint. So, you know, this is, you know, so I'm showing you here that, you know, it just varies, but that is one thing with Warlord. They've got some really awesome ranges, and then they've got some kind of bad, kind of not very good ranges. So it's definitely one of those companies where you have to kind of, you know, go on a case-by-case basis a little bit. But I generally say all their new stuff is good. Anyway, I'm digressing here, but I'm going to be painting this German sailor for you. It's kind of, and I think it's actually interesting, kind of refreshing, because, you know, you don't get to see in wargaming as much naval personnel, Air Force personnel, stuff like that, because they're just not as useful in war games. You're mostly doing sort of, you know, shooting, hand-to-hand combat, stuff that's handled by Marines and soldiers, and so the Navy and Air Force tends to get neglected and all of that. So this is one of those cases where, hey, you know, I get to do a totally different uniform. And the reason that these guys ended up fighting is mostly, as you expect, the Germans, particularly towards the end of the war, started to get desperate, and they just started to draft in anybody to fight that, you know, they could get to carry a gun, basically, that was not being used for anything else. And, you know, by the end of the war, the Germans also didn't exactly have a very powerful navy either, so they needed to do something with all those sailors. And you see them a little bit earlier too, like there are actual, you know, incidences of them. For example, the Battle of Arnhem during Operation Market Garden, when the Germans were really surprised by the paratroopers, they started enlisting basically any and all forces they had in the area, and that included some German sailors. So there's records of them fighting there as well. So the uniform I'm going to be doing here, he's really got a really classic naval uniform on. Some of the other guys in this pack are dressed in more conventional uniforms, I should say, but a lot of them still are wearing naval pea coats at least, or something like that. But he's got his bell bottoms, he's got his sailor shirt on, his sailor hat, you know, he's just full on. So this is going to be a lot of fun. It should be a lot of navy blue, white, I think the colors that you would really expect to see from a naval unit. And the equipment, of course, is going to be similar to what you would see on a normal German soldier, because that's the kind of stuff that they probably would have picked up and just incorporated into their kit. So, alright, let's go ahead and get started on this somewhat unusual figure. So the main color, of course, we're going to be dealing with in this uniform is navy blue, a color that pretty much all naval uniforms in the world seem to have in common, or at least they did at this particular time point. Now, so in this case, our sailor is wearing sort of a dress blue uniform, and that means that his pants, his top, and his hat as well are going to be painted in that color. Now, navy blue is a very, very dark blue, and so it's important that you have a really dark base color. So what I've picked out here is going to be a mixture of dark Prussian blue along with black. So I've really got a very, very dark shade here as my base. My first highlight is quite similar to my base color. I've just mixed a little bit less black into my dark Prussian blue here. I recommend when you're painting this figure that you really use good lighting, because especially in the early phases of highlighting, it's going to be sometimes very difficult to see the difference between the current layer you're painting and the base layer, because these dark colors are just, the contrast is really that low. But as you can see with this particular layer especially, I'm applying it very generously. It's really going pretty much everywhere except really the darkest areas of his uniform, so you don't have to worry too much if you're not being really precise here with your highlighting. My second highlight on the figure is going to be pure dark Prussian blue, and you can see it really has a distinctly blue cast relative to sort of the black-blue mixtures we were using before. And again, though, the contrast is not very good, so you're going to need to work hard to see where you're putting the paint. But as with the last layer, I'm not too concerned about applying it precisely or really blending it a lot, because it's still quite low contrast at this point. So, you know, you just want to avoid, again, getting it down in any deep creases and recesses, but you can otherwise kind of be applying this paint everywhere. Though, of course, just to get a little difference in tone, I recommend you try to put it on thinly and maybe then build it up in some choice areas like his calves or the top of his hat, things like that, where you expect it to be light-hitting, basically. Now, highlighting navy blue any further starts to get tricky, because if you've seen that color in real life or in photos, it's really dark. It tends to really absorb light. It's a lot like black, so you don't really get high contrast with it. But as we know, with 28mm figures, you need that high contrast for the figure to really stand out and look good. So I had to invent proper colors for making this brighter, but then without sort of taking away from the kind of the overall spirit of the outfit, I guess, and making it still feel like this is navy blue. And to keep that sort of spirit of navy blue intact, I guess, you want to choose kind of grayish shades for lightening your blue. Pure blue colors will give too much of a really blue cast, whereas navy is a more gray-black blue, so you need to stick with those kinds of tones. The color I used to lighten first here was Oxford blue, which I mixed into the dark Prussian blue, and you can see I'm applying it in a very precise way. It's very important here that you do that you're very careful. You paint all of the tops of all the folds and creases very neatly. You can't afford to be sloppy here, and you'll want to blend it out, of course, especially say around the bottoms of his pants and places like that are smoother, but where you expect there to be more light hitting, because of course you don't want it to get too light overall. You want to keep it thin and, you know, preserve that navy look. The important thing here is to be subtle and sparing, I guess, in applying your sort of brighter highlight layers. My next highlight here is just pure Oxford blue. If you feel that it's a little bit too light for your tastes,
at this point you can mix in some, say, Vallejo gray blue, and even though it's called gray blue, it's actually really a shade of gray with a slight bluish cast. And that will darken it down ever so slightly, and you can really feel free to go with sort of just grayer colors here in general. It's not a problem with navy. And I'm just continuing what I was doing before. I am applying this color just in areas where I want to emphasize that there's highlights and creases and stuff, but it just, as always, as you get up towards the top of your sort of highlight range, you just want to apply the paint more transparently, more sparingly, and that goes double, of course, since we're working with this very dark color here. We don't want to overdo it, and at this point I'm really focusing only on the areas where I really want emphasis, where there's really sharp creases and folds, and just trying to really blend it out into all the sort of other regions of the uniform. Now at this point you may be saying, haven't we highlighted this enough? I mean, it is supposed to be very dark blue, and yeah, normally I'd agree with you, but again, the rule that you need to always go brighter and highlight more and go for more extreme contrast than you normally think you do at this scale to get a good look, especially from a distance on the table. So I am continuing to highlight here. I have mixed a little bit, not very much, very sparing amount of sky gray into my extra blue. And sky gray is a very, very light gray shade, but it's great at lightening things, but still keeping that gray tinge that we want. And I'm just continuing to build up lighter and lighter color on these and sharp creases and around sort of cuffs, especially the top of the hat, because you expect there to be a lot of light hitting there in the front of the hat. So really all of the usual areas, but again, just less and less, blending it out a lot and just being more careful applying layers and being more subtle than you might be with other colors. And this is my absolute final highlight, I promise. I've just added even more sky gray in, and I'm using this now really mostly as an edge highlight, but again, really to make some of those sharp creases on his pants especially pop out, or around his sort of sailor collar and on top of his hat and the like. You could probably omit this step. It wouldn't, be really terrible if you didn't. But you can see now that the uniform is really high contrast. We've got a lot of shade variation, but it does probably feel a little bit too light for navy blue. So we're going to rectify that in our next step. And how are we going to do that, you may ask? Well, the best way to darken something down and even it out, and that is with a wash. What I have done here is made a mix of Citadel Azurman blue and Nuln oil, so we're going for kind of a black-blue color. And I'm going to be applying that all over the model. Be careful when you're putting the wash on something like this. You don't want it to pool, especially on sort of the lighter, higher contrast areas. It can be easy to get kind of a sort of an uneven, blotchy effect. So especially in those places, you want to be careful to really smooth the wash out so that you get an even coat. But what this is basically doing here is it's helping to sort of pull the colors together, which is really important when you've got such extremes, because we range from a really, really dark, almost black, up to a relatively light blue. And because there's such a big range there, this can be a good way to help kind of unify those two extremes and balance them out a little bit. And as of course, the other thing is that navy is really a dark black blue, so we want to tone down those extreme highlights that we just finished applying. And this is a great way to do it. We've now sort of, they're not quite so extreme. They don't feel so over the top as they did before. Everything's going to be a little bit more muted, a little bit more subtle. But because we took them to such a high level before, they now look appropriate when a wash has been applied. And you can see as I wash, I sort of stop, look at how things are, and I go back and I'm concentrating the wash in some extra sort of dark areas just to emphasize some folds and creases. I'm pretty happy now with how the uniform itself looks, so now I'm going to move on to the leather areas, which, as was the case, or is the case, I suppose, with other German uniforms, black is kind of the predominant color that you find. So I'm going to be painting his shoes or boots, I guess, in black as a base coat, and then his belt and sort of suspenders are going to get the same treatment as well. And also don't forget to do the top of his water canteen, because that's sort of usually sort of a painted black metal. I'm now going to start highlighting the leather, and I'm using the sort of same procedure I generally do for black leather. So I'm going to take German gray first, and I'm just going to apply that pretty much everywhere except in any really sharp folds or clear recesses or dividing lines. The shoes on this model are quite well sculpted, so it's very easy to see where you need to put the German gray and where you don't want to. And similar kind of story with his packs and his belt. Once that's done, I'm going to lighten the German gray somewhat by mixing in the blue gray. I'm using the blue gray because it gives a little bit of extra unity with the blue of his uniform, and I already have it on hand, and I'm a big believer in trying to paint a figure using sort of the minimum number of paints possible, working with what you have on the table and not having to get out tons and tons of different stuff, because it just complicates the process. So anyway, I've mixed a bit of that in, and now I'm just going to apply a slightly lighter kind of highlight where I want it to start, emphasizing where light is hitting on the leather areas. And then I'm just going to continue in that fashion. I'll then move up to just pure blue-gray as a highlight for sort of shinier areas on the leather, and then finally finish off by mixing a bit of sky gray in there so that I can get a really light sort of shiny effect. And that should be then going really sparingly, sort of like, as you can see, sort of on the tips and heels of his shoes, and then just kind of very subtle edge highlights here and there on his suspenders and belt packs, just to give the impression that sort of light is catching here and there, and just to emphasize sort of where there are different pieces of equipment, where the different dividing lines are coming out. I'm then going to base coat his mess bag, which is sort of the same that was carried by sort of normal German hair soldiers. I'm using here a base coat of German field gray World War II. And then I'm going to apply a real quick wash of Citadel Anthonian camo shade, which is kind of a drab green-brown color. Finally, I'm going to apply a highlight layer here of green-gray, and I'm going to make sure it's fairly thin here so I can build it up a little bit and get some slightly brighter areas and some slightly more subtle areas. You just want to, focus it on sort of all the higher areas and, make sure you pick out around all of the lines and little seams in this bag. Because this is such a small area, I don't feel a need to highlight it any further. Something which I might have done were this, a larger piece of equipment. I'm then going to paint the bottom half of his canteen using khaki gray as the base coat. And after I'm finished with that, I'm going to apply a slight wash just to darken it a little bit, and I'm going to do that using Agrax Earthshade. I'm then going to apply a quick highlight by mixing some Iraqi sand into the khaki gray and applying that kind of thinly and blending it out. And then I'm going to just finish off with a really high edge highlight, like on some of the straps or sort of the very centers of the sort of two sides, with just a dab of pure Iraqi sand. Now, of course, the most famous element of all sailor uniforms, besides the navy blue, of course, is the white piping and trim. And so I'm going to apply that now. Because I want to get a little depth and a little more interest to those white areas, I'm going to do it in 2 layers. So my base layer here is going to be sky gray, and you're going to, of course, want to make sure your paint is nice and thin so it flows very well, and you can apply these fine, thin lines. Now, you'll notice I put sort of a little cross thing on the front of his tie, and that's because I was looking at a lot of portraits of these guys, and I noticed they tended to just sort of, I don't know what it is, but it seemed that they sort of tied up, or they had a little strap or a little tie down, I guess, that went around their main tie. I don't know if to hold it in place or keep it from blowing around, maybe, I'm guessing, I'm not sure. So you can see, you can kind of simulate that by kind of painting a little X. Otherwise, you're probably going to want to put piping around the bottom of his sleeves. Of course, that'll depend on rank. And of course, there's going to be piping around the flap of his collar. Now, if you look at the uniforms, it would actually have been 3 perpendicular stripes, but at this scale, that's going to be almost impossible to paint without it looking too bulky and just not good. You just can't do it very well. So I suggest you just paint one broader line, and that will look very good. The other thing that's white, of course, on the uniform is they would have had Kriegsmarine written across the sort of the front of their hat, and you can't do that at this scale, again, very accurately. So you just kind of have to make some sort of blobs of paint like I've done that sort of simulate the look of some writing. Now here I'm making a slight adjustment to his collar, because I noticed from photographs that for whatever reason that sort of collar flap in the back was a slightly bluer blue than the rest of the uniform. So what I'm going to do here is go over it very lightly with normal Prussian blue, and that's going to give it a slightly different tone. I'm not going to put it down in the crease and folds. I want to keep those more dark, but you can see I'm applying it sort of over the lighter areas of that collar, and then I'm going to even mix a little bit of sky gray into it to lighten it up, and then use that to make a quick highlight for the tops of creases and such on that collar flap area. Now I'm just going to go back over all of those white areas with white. Surprise, surprise. Again, the paint is thinned well down so it'll flow, and I'm just going to start carefully going back over the lines that I just created and sharpening them up and brightening them up. You may find that you need to apply a couple of layers, especially in some areas, to get a bright enough white, but that can work to your advantage because that allows you to build up some natural shading and highlighting on these sort of piping areas where you feel there should be brighter areas and darker areas on the model. And this is really just a case of having some patience and a steady hand. And if you make mistakes, which is pretty much inevitable, you can just go back in with some Oxford blue or whatever and sort of clean up along the edges, and you really won't see a thing. You can see I got lines too wide or too messy, and I went in with just a dark blue and ran along the edges to sort of correct that and make sure all my lines were even and smooth looking when I was finished. I'm now quickly going to be painting the metal areas of his hand grenade. I am base coating them here with extra dark green, and then I'm going to apply a highlight of the German field gray World War II. I'm just going to take care not to put it down in any of the seams between the different areas of metal so that there's, still very clear, distinct parts visible. When you're done with that, you can choose to highlight it further if you want by mixing some of the green gray in there like we did on the bag, and then apply it, say, to the very top or sort of the upper surfaces of the hand grenade so that sort of the back side is slightly darker and in more shadow than the front. Next, I'm going to take care of the kind of wood areas on this figure, and I'm base coating them using Foundry Bay Brown Medium, and that includes here the handle of his hand grenade and of course the stock of his rifle. You're just going to want to base coat those. I also wanted to take care of, there's a little leather strap, brown leather strap on his canteen. I'm base coating that in German camouflage black brown. Once that's done, I'm going to start highlighting here with Foundry Chestnut Shade. Again, as always, I should say, I'm applying it to the lightest areas first and then blending it outwards. And you want the wood, of course, to be very light and very red, so you can apply it quite generously, build up some layers. I'm also going to apply a very, very small, thin amount, a little bit on the leather strap area, just to give the impression of some wear and some difference in color, but you should be quite subtle there. You don't want it as bright or red, obviously, as you would on the gun barrel or the hand grenade handle. As always, I'm going to apply a final sort of edge highlight to the wood of Chestnut Medium. Like with the Chestnut Shade, I apply it first to the edges and blend it out, but I just apply it a little less, just make sure the lines are thinner, and just really, you know, make sure I'm using it to define the different pieces of wood, and, you know, just kind of build it up and kind of blend it out, I guess, to your taste. And you can, by the way, use a tiny bit on the leather strap on the canteen if you want, but it really should just be the finest, lightest dot or amount possible. I'm next going to really quickly take care of the insignia on his hat. He's got kind of a gold eagle with a little white and red dot below it. So I base coated the eagle with German camouflage black brown, and I base coated the circle with sky gray. And then in order to kind of finish that off, I highlighted the eagle carefully with just some Vallejo Air gold. And then the circle, of course, I highlighted in a pure white. And then I finished off by taking a drop of Citadel Mephiston red and putting that in the center of the circle. So to finish off here, I'm going to be painting the steel metal areas on the figure, and those are mostly going to be on the gun. So I've taken a base coat, which is a mix of German gray and Vallejo Air gunmetal, and I'm applying that to the barrel and all the sort of mechanisms on the gun. You can also apply a little bit on that canteen if you want to get a little metal look, or the buckle and the strap, depending on how much detail you want. Anyway, once that's done, I just took the pure Vallejo Air gunmetal and sort of very lightly use that to apply a highlight, especially along the sort of the top part of the gun where light's hitting the metal, make it a little bit shinier and the like. But of course go light here, because you don't want your metal parts to feel too shiny or too blingy, because that's not the idea when you're doing gun hardware. So here is our finished World War II German sailor who's been drafted into a combat action. I was really happy with how this figure worked out. I wasn't sure at the beginning how I was going to do with painting navy blue, because I haven't done it very much before, and it is a tricky color, really. In some ways, I think it's actually harder to deal with in black, but I really am pleased with how it worked. I think highlighting with grays and gray blues was very successful, and then very importantly, of course, applying that wash step to kind of unify the colors and darken it down. And you know, the point is, yes, maybe it's lighter than pure navy blue, but I think it's very much in the spirit of that color, and but it maintains the necessary contrast that you really have to have when you're painting something of this size. It'll still look good and pop out from a distance, or, you know, if you're not looking at it very close. But actually, it still looks, I think, very good up close as well. I recommend when you finish this figure, particularly, you're going to want to apply some good matte varnish to it. I had to, because otherwise it looks too shiny, because these dark blues, particularly, at least from Vallejo, have a real strong tendency to dry a little shiny. Not like really shiny, but sort of satin, and that's not attractive. So you're going to need your matte varnish. I ended up using a enamel varnish, because I find that quite a few acrylic varnish, especially the Vallejo ones, don't actually dry that dead matte. But enamel, you can guarantee it will dry really flat every single time. So if all else fails, use enamel varnish. So I think that's most everything I wanted to say. As always, if you enjoyed this video, please like it, please share it, leave me comments with what you thought, subscribe if you have not done so already, of course, so you can keep up with my channel updates, and I will see you next time.